Florence was not born powerful, it was made powerful. Not by kings, not by conquerors, but by a family who understood something the world had not yet learned. For 300 years, the Medici rose from merchants to the rulers behind popes, queens, artists, and armies. They financed genius, negotiated nations, survived exile, assassination, scandal, and built a world that still surrounds us today. This is not just a story of a dynasty. This is the story of how power is created, how it is kept, and how it is lost. The Medici family, masters of power. Long before the Medici became a dynasty, they were just another family living in the hills of Mugello, a quiet region north of Florence. The land there was rugged and demanding. Families survived by working with their hands, tending sheep, and selling wool to the cloth merchants in the city. Life was simple, but harsh seasons and hard soil taught discipline and patience. The Medici did not grow up with gold, titles, or armies. They grew up with work. The earliest known ancestor, Everardo de' Medici, was remembered as a soldier of strong character, not a noble, but respected. He earned small parcels of land, not through inheritance, but through service. That land fed the family for generations. From him came a belief passed quietly from father to son. Earn respect quietly. Let deeds speak. This was not a motto carved in stone. It lived in the way they handled themselves. Measured words, steady choices, no unnecessary enemies. Their family name, Medici, means the physicians. Some believed their ancestors had once provided medical care. Others said the name reflected something deeper. The family's habit of solving problems calmly, easing tensions, healing situations rather than inflaming them. Whether true or not, the name shaped how others viewed them. Even before power, the Medici were seen as helpers, mediators, people who eased conflict. In a city known for pride and rivalry, this reputation would become priceless. By the late 1300s, Florence was booming with trade, especially wool and banking. Young men traveled from the countryside to the city to learn crafts, bookkeeping, and commerce. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, born around 1360, was one of them. He did not arrive with wealth, but he arrived with something more valuable: discipline, humility, and the ability to read people well. He understood something simple: people trust those who understand them. Giovanni entered Florence quietly. No banners, no grand claims, just a young man with careful eyes. He began as a clerk in someone else's bank. He watched how merchants argued, how guilds negotiated, how loans were made and repaid. He learned that in Florence, money was not just money. It was influence, reputation, and survival. And Giovanni learned how to use it carefully. Giovanni grew slowly, step by step. He did not rush to seem important. He worked long hours, listened more than he spoke, and made no enemies. When he finally founded the Medici Bank, it was not flashy. It was simply reliable. Clients noticed that Giovanni never mocked failure, never humiliated debtors, and never made promises he could not keep. Trust became the Medici signature. He built relationships the way others built walls, carefully, brick by brick. If a merchant had a bad season, Giovanni would extend credit instead of closing doors. If a craftsman struggled with taxes, Giovanni helped him negotiate. These gestures were small by themselves, but when repeated across dozens of people, they formed something stronger than gold: loyalty. Clients began to say, "Go to the Medici. They will treat you fairly." Inside the bank, Giovanni demanded clarity. Bookkeeping had to be exact. Letters to other branches had to be uniform. There was no room for lies or guesses. He insisted on accuracy because accuracy meant stability, and stability meant endurance. Where other bankers gambled on risky ventures or political favor, Giovanni preferred smaller, certain gains. He did not want to be the richest banker. He wanted to be the most trusted. Generosity also became part of the Medici identity. When a church needed repairs, Medici funds appeared quietly. When a widow needed a dowry so her daughters could marry, the Medici assisted. Not with speeches, not with statues. In silence, Florence noticed. Goodwill wrapped the family like armor. In a city where envy could ruin a man, public warmth was a shield. By the time Giovanni was an older man, the Medici were not yet rulers. But they were already something more powerful. The family everyone preferred to deal with. Florence had many banks, but only one made you feel respected. That was the Medici advantage, and it would become the foundation of an empire. Florence looked beautiful from the outside: cathedrals, marble, markets, scholars. But inside it was sharp and divided. Wealth brought competition. Competition brought jealousy. Jealousy brought plots. Families like the Albizzi and Strozzi had controlled Florentine politics for decades. They believed power belonged only to them. Anyone rising too fast became a target. The city was governed by councils that rotated frequently, supposedly to ensure fairness. But behind elections were whispers, deals, favors, and pressure. Politics in Florence was not a game, it was survival. A wrong alliance could cost a family its business, its home, or its safety. Exile was common. One day you were respected, the next you were driven out with nothing. In this environment, Giovanni's humility protected him. He did not challenge the ruling families. He did not demand office or influence. He remained patient. But Florence watched, and Florence remembered. When a family gives steady help in a city full of pride, that family becomes trusted by the people, not just the elite. And the people of Florence were many, far more than the ruling council. The Albizzi began to worry. They saw merchants, guild leaders, and even small shopkeepers turning toward the Medici. Meanwhile, Giovanni's son Cosimo was emerging, educated, thoughtful, respected, and deeply connected through patronage and generosity. The Albizzi recognized a threat the Medici did not declare, but did not need to. Florence was not only about coins and councils, it was about perception. The moment the people believed the Medici were the heartbeat of the city, they were the heartbeat of the city. And the Albizzi could feel that shift. Quiet power was the most dangerous kind. The turning point came when Giovanni secured the greatest financial client in Europe, the papacy. The Catholic Church needed a bank that could safely manage tithes, taxes, and donations across many territories. They needed someone discreet, stable, and loyal. Giovanni was all three. Handling the Pope's finances did more than increase wealth. It gave the Medici access to every region that sent money to Rome, and every bishop, cardinal, and noble connected to church affairs. The Medici Bank became the quiet engine behind the church's operations. And the church in return offered something more valuable than gold: legitimacy. Where other bankers bragged about success, Giovanni kept his papal role discreet. But people noticed anyway. When the church backed a project in Florence, the Medici were involved. When a bishop needed credit to fund a cathedral or campaign, the Medici facilitated it. Power flowed through trust, not threats. This new influence stretched across Europe. In Bruges, London, Venice, and Rome, Medici clerks and partners worked under the same rules: organized records, fair dealing, precise letters. The Medici Bank became a network of disciplined minds, all connected to the same clear standard of behavior. This was not just business, it was a system. By the time Giovanni died, the Medici were no longer just merchants. They were the fiscal backbone of Christian Europe. And the family's future was now in the hands of Cosimo, who had learned to use wealth not as display, but as leverage. Cosimo inherited his father's calm and his family's caution. But he also had something new: vision. He believed Florence could become the heart of art, knowledge, and civilization. And he believed the Medici could guide that transformation. The Albizzi saw this and grew afraid. A rival who wants only profit is manageable. A rival with ideas is dangerous. In 1433, the Albizzi acted. They accused Cosimo of plotting to overthrow the Republic. He was arrested and held in a tower in the Palazzo Vecchio. He knew that many prisoners never saw sunlight again. Yet Cosimo remained calm. He spoke politely to his guards. He funded meals for them out of his own purse. He waited. His patience unsettled his enemies. The Albizzi wanted him executed. But even they understood a dangerous truth. Cosimo was too valuable to Florence's economy. Merchants whispered, guilds protested. Foreign partners asked questions. Killing Cosimo could break the city's financial spine, so instead they exiled him. It was meant to be a humiliation. Cosimo left Florence without anger. In Venice, he continued business, strengthened relationships, funded work, and waited. Meanwhile, Florence began to struggle. Trade slowed, tensions rose. The Albizzi lost face. It did not take long for the city to realize something clear. Florence worked best when the Medici were at its center. Within a year, Cosimo was recalled. But he did not return in triumph, shouting victory. He returned quietly, respectfully, exactly in the Medici style. But Florence had changed. The people now knew who steadied the city. The Medici did not take power. Florence gave it to them. When Cosimo returned from exile, he came back a changed man. Exile had not broken him. It had sharpened him. He had seen how fragile Florence was without stable guidance, and he understood that power must be protected quietly, not displayed openly. He did not seek revenge against the Albizzi, even though many expected it. Instead, he focused on restoring confidence in the city. Merchants returned to trading tables, workshops reopened, and credit flowed again. Florence began to breathe normally, and people recognized that the city's recovery was tied to Cosimo's calm hand. Cosimo knew that Florence could not be ruled by force. A violent takeover would only create new enemies and invite rebellion. So he used patronage, the giving of work, loans, and support, to build a loyal circle. When guilds needed funding, he provided it. When public buildings needed repairs, he financed them. When young artists and scholars needed a sponsor, he supported them. People did not feel ordered by Cosimo. They felt supported by him. In a city used to pride and rivalry, the experience of being seen and valued was powerful. Behind the scenes, Cosimo strategically placed allies in important positions. Seats in the Signoria, the government council, shifted gradually toward men who respected him. Court judges, tax officers, diplomatic clerks, and guild leaders quietly aligned with the Medici. There were no dramatic speeches, no banners, no fanfare. But over time, decisions began to reflect Cosimo's influence. People voted not because they were threatened, but because they trusted him to keep Florence stable. This was not tyranny. It was soft power, built on relationship, reputation, and memory. Cosimo also understood the emotional heart of the city. Florence was proud of its beauty, its churches, streets, and civic pride. So he invested in the city itself. He funded the completion of Brunelleschi's dome, a project many had doubted could be finished. He built libraries, restored convents, and supported scholars who would later spark the Renaissance. These were not just buildings, they were symbols. Florence looked stronger, richer, wiser, and every stone laid reminded citizens who had made that possible. Power became architecture. Cosimo held no royal title, no official crown, no throne. But when people needed leadership, they looked to him. When guilds debated policy, they considered his opinion. When disputes arose, they asked for his guidance. The Medici did not seize Florence. The city leaned toward them, step by step, until the balance settled in their favor. Cosimo became known as Pater Patriae, father of the homeland, not because he ruled by fear, but because he ruled by trust. During the period in which Cosimo returned from exile, Florence needed more than stability. It needed direction. The cathedral stood unfinished, its grand body waiting for a dome that no one had yet dared to build. For years, architects argued and citizens complained, but the sky still opened over the church like a wound. To complete it would require something Florence had never seen before: a mixture of faith, mathematics, courage, and vision. Cosimo understood that the city needed not just leadership, but a symbol, something enormous and undeniable that would pull Florence together. So he placed his support behind a man as bold as the dream: Filippo Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi was not universally loved. He was stubborn, argumentative, and often refused to explain his methods. Yet he possessed a rare gift. He could see entire structures in his mind before a single stone was laid. His proposed dome would be wider than any built since Rome's Pantheon. Many believed it would collapse under its own weight. Others mocked him in the streets, but Cosimo did not laugh. He listened. He saw that Brunelleschi carried the same quiet certainty Cosimo used to rebuild his own family's power. And so, Cosimo invested money, reputation, and political capital behind a plan that seemed impossible. Construction began. The city watched as scaffolding rose high above the rooftops. Workers moved slowly along beams, balancing life on inches of space. Some days, Florence held its breath. If the dome failed, it would not just crush stone, it would crush civic pride. Cosimo visited the worksite often, not as a ruler inspecting progress, but as a man standing beside others in shared hope. His presence mattered. It said, "We do this together." That message resonated deeply. The dome was not just a building, it was a promise to the city itself. As the dome rose brick by brick, Florence began to change. Travelers spoke of the construction as a miracle. Merchants boasted of their city's courage. Even children played games pretending to build domes of their own. Cosimo's decision had done something subtle but powerful. It reshaped how the city saw itself. A city that attempts the impossible begins to think of itself differently. Florence was no longer just a center of trade. It was becoming a center of creation. When the dome was completed, bells rang from every tower. Crowds gathered, singing hymns and cheering. People cried openly. Brunelleschi had built the impossible, and Cosimo had made it possible. Yet he did not place his name on the cathedral. He did not commission statues of himself. Instead, he allowed Florence to shine. Everyone knew who stood behind the victory, but Cosimo preferred pride shared, not claimed. This was his genius. He led by giving the city reasons to love itself. And in loving Florence, the people loved him. Cosimo believed that power built only on money and buildings would fade. True power had to be rooted in ideas. Florence had priests and scholars, but their learning was narrow and controlled. Cosimo wanted something broader, knowledge that explored human potential, beauty, reason, and purpose. This led him to support the growing movement called humanism, which sought to rediscover ancient Greek and Roman thought. For Cosimo, humanism was not only philosophy, it was a way to shape how Florence thought about itself. Cosimo gathered manuscripts from distant lands and brought scholars together to study them. One of the most important was Marsilio Ficino, a gentle, thoughtful man with a deep love for ancient wisdom. Cosimo gave Ficino a home, books, and space to think. Ficino translated Plato's works into Italian and Latin, making them accessible to ordinary citizens, not just clerics. For the first time in centuries, Florentines read ideas that celebrated human reason, creativity, and the dignity of the individual. These ideas changed how people viewed life itself. The Medici Palace became a place of conversation. Scholars, painters, sculptors, poets, and travelers shared ideas late into the night. The air inside those rooms was filled with curiosity and laughter, arguments, and discovery. Cosimo did not dictate what should be said. He believed ideas must grow freely. The city, once focused on trade and competition, began to value thought and imagination. People started to ask different questions. What makes a life meaningful? What makes something beautiful? What does it mean to live well? These questions did not weaken Florence, they strengthened it. Workers took greater pride in their craft. Artists saw deeper meaning in their work. Young men dreamed not only of wealth, but of leaving something worthy behind. Cosimo had achieved something remarkable. He made learning itself prestigious. A city that values knowledge becomes harder to control by fear and easier to unify with inspiration. And people knew who made this possible. Cosimo had created not only wealth, but an intellectual identity. Florence was no longer simply a marketplace. It was a mind alive, curious, and reaching towards something greater than profit. This made the Medici more than bankers. It made them architects of culture. In Florence, art was everywhere. On church walls, city squares, doors, windows, and altars. Beauty was part of daily life. But Cosimo saw that art could be more than beauty. It could be a language of influence. When an artist succeeded, the patron who supported him also rose in reputation. Fame traveled with the artwork. If the artwork inspired admiration, the patron was admired too. Cosimo understood this and used it carefully. He supported artists not just because they were skilled, but because they spoke to the spirit of Florence. Donatello carved figures with such emotion that people felt the story in the stone. Fra Angelico painted sacred scenes that seemed to float with light. When these works appeared in churches, courtyards, and public chapels, Florence saw not only beauty, it saw Medici generosity. But this generosity was not vanity. Cosimo did not demand portraits of himself in gold robes. Instead, he funded works that reminded the city of faith, history, courage, and unity. In this way, he shaped public feeling. Other families tried to imitate him, but they lacked his restraint. They commissioned grand portraits of themselves, hoping to appear powerful. Yet the people could tell the difference. The Medici gave Florence art that elevated the city. Their rivals gave art that elevated their ego. The public does not forget such things. When people looked around and saw beauty, they believed Florence was rising. And if Florence was rising, then surely the Medici must be guiding it. Art also strengthened alliances. When Cosimo funded a chapel renovation for an allied family, that family's loyalty deepened. When he funded a public fountain, merchants thanked him. When he helped repair a monastery, monks prayed for him. No decrees, no threats, just memory. And memory is a powerful form of loyalty. You cannot legislate gratitude, you must earn it. This was Cosimo's brilliance. He understood that lasting power comes from affection, not fear. And art, more than money, builds affection that lasts long after the man is gone. But Florence was not a city where power went unchallenged. The Albizzi, Strozzi, and other noble families never forgave Cosimo for returning from exile stronger than before. They believed leadership should belong to old noble bloodlines, not a merchant family whose wealth came from ledgers. Behind closed doors, they whispered, planned, and waited. Cosimo was respected, yes, but respect can turn to suspicion if one man becomes admired too deeply. They watched every move the Medici made. When Cosimo funded libraries, they called it propaganda. When he supported public works, they said he was buying love. When he backed scholars, they warned that learning would weaken religion. Their public voices questioned Cosimo's intentions, while their private messages sought allies in distant courts. Florence smiled on the surface, but beneath the surface, there were teeth. Cosimo understood the danger. He did not underestimate his rivals. He knew Florence could turn quickly, just as it had once turned against him. This awareness made him careful. He did not draw attention to his influence. He never sat at the head of the council table, though everyone knew the real discussions happened in his private rooms. His power had to remain unseen, because unseen power is harder to strike. The Albizzi attempted small attacks, pushing for policies that would disadvantage Medici allies, questioning the bank's practices, spreading rumors. None of these worked. Cosimo countered each with patience. He never responded with anger. He never accused them openly. He outlasted them. And that is how power survives in a city of envy. Not by force, but by endurance. Florence began to realize something unmistakable. The Albizzi wanted control. Cosimo wanted Florence to thrive. The city chose the one who chose them. In his later years, Cosimo watched the city he helped build flourish. The dome stood complete, art filled the streets, scholars debated in public squares, and Florence had become the cultural heart of Italy. Visitors traveled from distant lands to witness its beauty and spirit. Cosimo did not mark these achievements with celebration. He remained humble. Yet he knew what he had done. He had changed the city's soul. His final years were quieter. He spent time in his gardens, surrounded by books and voices of philosophy. He did not speak of power. He spoke of balance, community, and legacy. He knew that rulers who seek fame fade quickly, but those who plant roots remain. So he left Florence not monuments of himself, but a structure of culture and learning that could continue without him. When he died in 1464, Florence mourned deeply. Bells rang across the city, shops closed, citizens stood in silence. People did not cry because they feared what would come next. They cried because they felt they had lost someone who truly cared for them. Cosimo was buried not as a ruler, but as the father of the city. And the city meant it. But every era shifts. With Cosimo's passing, the weight of Florence moved to the next generation. His grandson, Lorenzo, would inherit not only power, but expectation. Florence would soon become brighter, louder, more brilliant, and more vulnerable. Cosimo built stability. Lorenzo would bring glory, and glory always comes with a price. When Cosimo died in 1464, Piero took over leadership of the family, but his health was failing. Lorenzo, still a teenager, began accompanying his father to government meetings. He observed alliances, tensions, and agreements being formed. He also traveled on diplomatic missions across Italy, where he learned how other states viewed Florence, with respect, jealousy, or quiet fear. These trips shaped him. He saw that Florence was admired, but also surrounded by enemies waiting for weakness. When Piero died in 1469, Lorenzo was only 20. But Florence did not hesitate. The city turned to him immediately, not because of law or tradition, but because the people trusted him. The guilds supported him. Merchants respected him. The artists and scholars loved him. He was young, but he carried himself with a confidence that made others feel safe. He did not seize power. He received it. Lorenzo led differently than Cosimo. Where Cosimo ruled quietly, Lorenzo ruled openly. He became the face of Florence, walking the streets, greeting citizens, hosting celebrations, sponsoring festivals, and turning the city into a living stage of beauty. He became the heart of Florence, admired not because he demanded admiration, but because he made the city feel alive. Under Lorenzo's guidance, Florence transformed into a center of creativity the world had never seen. Lorenzo believed that art was not just decoration. It was identity. He opened his home to poets, sculptors, painters, and musicians. Artists did not simply work for pay. They worked in a community of inspiration. Florentine workshops became laboratories of imagination, where new ideas were tested like scientific experiments. Botticelli painted faces that seemed to breathe. His Birth of Venus captured grace and wonder in a way no artist had done before. Leonardo da Vinci, always restless, studied light, shadows, and anatomy with a level of curiosity that bordered on obsession. Lorenzo encouraged him instead of restraining him. And then there was Michelangelo, discovered as a gifted boy carving marble. Lorenzo saw genius in him immediately and brought him to live in the Medici palace itself. Michelangelo later said Lorenzo was a father to my mind. Florence became a city in motion. Workers built new chapels and plazas. Musicians played in garden courtyards. Scholars debated in open squares. Markets buzzed with trade from across Europe. And all of it, every note, every stone, every stroke of pigment, led back to Lorenzo. He was not simply a patron, he was a conductor directing the music of a civilization. Through art, Florence gained influence far beyond its size. Visitors returned home with stories of wonder and innovation. Other cities tried to imitate Florence's style, its architecture, its fashion, its music. And because Lorenzo stood at the center of it all, admiration for Florence became admiration for the Medici. Culture had become a weapon of power, one that conquered hearts instead of territories. Yet this golden age cast long shadows. Beauty attracts admiration, but it also breeds envy. And Florence was being watched. The Medici's rise had made enemies among noble families who resented their influence. The Pazzi family, wealthy and ambitious, felt overshadowed. They believed they deserved leadership, not the Medici. They found an ally in Pope Sixtus IV, who feared Lorenzo's growing influence in church affairs. Quiet meetings took place. Letters traveled secretly. A plan formed, not to humiliate Lorenzo, but to eliminate him physically. The chosen moment was Palm Sunday, 1478, inside Santa Maria del Fiore, the great cathedral. The city gathered for worship. Lorenzo and his younger brother Giuliano stood together near the altar. Giuliano, beloved and gentle, trusted the crowd. As the priest raised the host, the attackers moved. Giuliano was stabbed again and again. He fell in seconds. Lorenzo was struck as well, but he fought back, slashing his attackers with a hidden dagger and escaping behind the altar. The sacred space became chaos. Screams filled the cathedral. Worshippers fled. Blood stained the marble floor. The conspirators expected panic to turn into rebellion. They believed Florence would side with old nobility over Medici influence. They miscalculated. Florence did not rise for the Pazzi. It rose for Lorenzo. The city saw the attack not just as murder, but as an assault on Florence itself. Crowds seized conspirators in the streets. Executions followed quickly and publicly. The Pazzi name was erased from records, their lands confiscated, their homes stripped of their crest. But the cost was immense. Giuliano was gone. His death scarred Lorenzo's spirit forever. The light in him dimmed. He became more guarded, more strategic, more cautious. He understood now that power would always require protection. This moment changed Lorenzo, from Florence's beloved son into its unyielding guardian. The Pazzi conspiracy did not end with punishment. The Pope condemned Lorenzo for executing conspirators connected to the church. Soon, Florence was threatened by war. Armies gathered, alliances formed. The papacy and the Kingdom of Naples moved against Florence. It was no longer a matter of politics. It was survival. Lorenzo chose a bold path. He traveled alone to Naples to negotiate directly with the king, risking imprisonment or death. His advisors warned him that he might never return, but Lorenzo understood that great danger sometimes requires great courage. In Naples, he spoke with dignity, confidence, and intelligence. His presence shifted the political atmosphere. The king agreed to peace. Florence was spared. But while the city survived, the Medici Bank suffered deeply. The cost of war was enormous. Foreign branches struggled, loans failed, trade routes shifted. The bank that had funded the Renaissance now faced collapse. Lorenzo could no longer lead with generosity alone. He tightened financial control, consolidated power, and guided Florence through force of will rather than charm. This changed the nature of Medici power. The family was no longer simply loved, it was needed, and necessity is a heavy burden. Rivals who once whispered now waited for weakness. The Medici had reached their highest point of glory, and the edge of danger lay directly beneath their feet. Lorenzo's health began to fade in his early 40s. Years of stress, grief, responsibility, and constant pressure had worn him down. Yet, he did not retreat. He continued to guide Florence, meet with scholars, support artists, and mediate disputes. Even weakened, his presence kept Florence steady. The city still looked to him for direction. As word spread of his declining health, Florence grew uneasy. People knew what his leadership meant. They understood that Lorenzo was more than a patron or a statesman. He was the glue holding Florence together. Without him, old rivalries could resurface. Foreign powers could seize opportunity. The peace he had negotiated and the cultural glory he had built might not survive him. Lorenzo died on April 8, 1492, at the age of 43. His death shook Florence. The bells did not sound triumphant, but mournful and heavy. Citizens wept openly. Artists painted him not as a ruler, but as a guardian. Scholars read poems in his honor. People spoke of him as the soul of the city. He was given the name Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent, not because he demanded it, but because Florence believed it. But grief soon turned into fear. Without Lorenzo's steady hand, Florence was suddenly exposed. The alliances he built were fragile. The peace he maintained hung by threads. The cultural brilliance he nurtured would soon collide with new struggles, new leaders, and a new storm rising at the edge of the city. The Golden Age was ending. The Age of Fire was beginning. When Lorenzo the Magnificent died in 1492, Florence felt as though a protective warmth had been extinguished. The man who had held the city together through charm, diplomacy, and cultural leadership was gone. His death left a silence that was not just emotional, but political. Tension that had been softened by his presence now resurfaced like iron beneath velvet. Florence was uncertain, restless, and bruised by memory. Into this atmosphere stepped Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar whose sermons did not soothe the soul. They attacked it. Savonarola had been preaching in Florence for several years, but only now did the city hear him with its full heart. His voice rang through the cathedral like a hammer striking stone. He did not speak of art, beauty, or philosophy. He spoke of wrath, judgment, and divine punishment. He claimed Florence had been chosen by God, not for blessing, but for testing. He described visions of angels and fire, cities collapsing, and sinners dragged to ruin. In a city shaken by loss, these words sounded less like warnings and more like truth arriving at last. People who had once felt pride in Florence's brilliance now felt exposed. The wealth of the Medici, the elegance of their palaces, the paintings and sculptures that filled the churches. Savonarola called these sins of vanity. To citizens already anxious about money, plague, and political instability, the message landed with frightening clarity. They had not only admired beauty, they had worshipped it. Guilt spread quickly, and guilt always looks for someone to blame, or someone to follow. Savonarola's power did not rise through politics, but through emotion. He spoke to the fears of the poor, the frustrations of the middle class, and the moral anxiety of the devout. He called for purity, discipline, and sacrifice. His followers, many of them young boys, began patrolling the streets, encouraging modesty, silence, and obedience. Their presence changed the way Florence breathed. A city that once hummed with laughter and music now listened to itself in fearful quiet. Under Savonarola's growing influence, Florence shifted from a city of human possibility to a city of spiritual alarm. The Renaissance, with all its color and wonder, began to feel like a dangerous indulgence. And once a city becomes ashamed of what once made it great, it is already halfway to destroying itself. The turning point came when Savonarola urged Florence to rid itself of anything that encouraged pride or pleasure. He called for a public cleansing, a bonfire of vanities. Citizens were told to bring anything that reflected earthly desire: mirrors, playing cards, cosmetics, musical instruments, ornate clothing, and even books. But the command did not stop there. Paintings, sculptures, and drawings, the very lifeblood of Florence's creative identity, were also declared sinful if they celebrated beauty rather than holiness. What had once been precious became suspect. The bonfire took place in the city square, where laughter and markets had once filled the air. This time, it was silence and hymn singing. The flames rose high, bright enough to be seen from rooftops across Florence. Objects that represented years of skill and pride were thrown into the fire. Works of art that would one day be priceless were lost in an afternoon of smoke. Some artists destroyed their own creations to avoid shame. The city did not simply burn possessions, it burned memory. The crowd watched with a complicated mix of guilt, fear and surrender. Some believed this was redemption. Some believed it was madness. Many simply followed because not following was dangerous. The air that night smelled of wood, paint, oil, leather, and silk. The smell of identity turning to ash. One could almost feel Florence's spirit rising into the smoke, leaving behind something blank and trembling. Among the most devastating moments was the change in Botticelli. Once a celebrated painter of grace and imagination, he fell into Savonarola's spell and destroyed his own paintings. The man who had once captured the beauty of myth now feared that beauty itself was sin. When artists begin to fear creation, a city loses the sound of its own heartbeat. Florence did not understand yet what it had done, but history would remember. This was the day the Renaissance was not overthrown by force. It was abandoned out of fear. A city that once defined the world's sense of wonder now doubted the very idea of joy. During this cultural turning, Medici leadership was weakening from within. Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo's eldest son, inherited power without inheriting the qualities needed to hold it. He lacked his grandfather Cosimo's patience and his father's emotional intelligence. Piero was impulsive, short-tempered, and accustomed to comfort. The city watched him closely and not kindly. Without Lorenzo's warmth, Medici influence felt less like guidance and more like entitlement. In 1494, a crisis struck Italy when King Charles VIII of France marched into the peninsula with a large army, claiming dominion over Naples. Florence lay directly in the path of military movement. It needed a leader who could negotiate boldly and defend the city's dignity. But Piero panicked. Instead of firm negotiation, he surrendered valuable fortresses and made concessions so humiliating that Florence felt publicly shamed. He had not protected the city. He had embarrassed it before Europe. The reaction was swift and explosive. Citizens gathered in the streets shouting, banging on the doors of Medici homes, demanding accountability. The same Florence that once adored Lorenzo now shouted for his son's removal. Public opinion did not shift slowly. It flipped like a table overturned in fury. Piero fled the city under darkness, taking only what he could carry. His exit was not dignified. It was desperate. The Medici were expelled, their banners torn down, their emblems scraped from stone, their palaces seized and searched. The fall was not just political. It was emotional, cathartic, and purifying for a city that felt deceived by luxury and weakness. Florence declared itself free again. The people believed they were reclaiming honesty, virtue, and civic pride. Piero would forever be known as Piero the Unfortunate. He did not lose Florence because the Medici were hated. He lost Florence because he showed Florence he could not protect it. And Florence does not forgive a protector who fails. With the Medici gone, Savonarola's influence reached its peak. He reshaped Florence into a theocratic republic, not ruled by wealth or nobility, but by moral judgment. Civic celebrations were replaced with prayer assemblies. Street music was replaced with hymns. Fashion gave way to plain cloth. Theaters closed, festivals dissolved. Florence became a city defined not by what it created, but by what it renounced. Silence replaced song, suspicion replaced delight. But power built on fear eventually turns inward. Savonarola's sermons grew harsher. Any hesitation or disagreement was labeled corruption. People began whispering in houses, closing windows before speaking. Neighbors watched neighbors. The young boys who once collected vanities now patrolled for signs of disobedience. Florence had replaced one form of influence with another, and this one came with no laughter, no forgiveness, no joy. Outside the city, the Pope grew alarmed. Savonarola had attacked the church's authority openly, claiming to speak with God's voice alone. He refused to remain silent. Relations broke. Florence was threatened with excommunication. Fear returned. But this time, not fear of sin, but fear of political isolation. The city began to pull away from the preacher who had once saved it. The collapse came quickly. A public test of divine truth was proposed, a trial by fire. Savonarola accepted. But when the day came, the trial fell apart in confusion and embarrassment. The crowds, once devoted, now shouted in anger. The spell had broken, not with argument or force, but with exhaustion. Florence had given too much, suffered too much, and waited too long for salvation that never arrived. Savonarola was arrested, tortured, condemned, and executed in the same square where he had burned the vanities. The flames that once devoured Florence's beauty now devoured the man who commanded them. The city watched in silence, not out of triumph, but out of a deep, weary understanding. It had allowed itself to be ruled by fear, and fear had led it to destroy what it loved. After Savonarola's fall, Florence was politically weak, internally fractured, and surrounded by powerful neighbors with ambitions of their own. The Medici, though exile-stricken, still had allies in the highest places, and one of them, Lorenzo's son Giovanni, was now a cardinal. Influence that once came from Florence now came from the church itself. When Spanish forces marched into Tuscany, the Medici returned not with applause, but with soldiers behind them. The city did not resist. It was tired. Tired of Puritan strictness, tired of fear, tired of instability. But Florence did not welcome the Medici with the old affection. The relationship had changed. The Medici were no longer first among equals, guiding the city through trust and patronage. They were authorities, backed by military strength and papal power. The warmth was gone. What remained was structure, order, and necessity. This shift marked the true end of the Renaissance spirit in Florence. Art would continue, buildings would rise, philosophy would flourish. But the intimate bond between the city and the Medici had broken. The family that once led by inspiring admiration now ruled through political position. The Medici became rulers, not caretakers. Florence had survived revolution, fear, fire, exile, and return. But it had lost something precious in the process: its innocence, its confidence, its unity with the family that once loved it back. The Medici had returned, but neither Florence nor the Medici would ever be the same. When the Medici returned to Florence in 1512, they did not simply reclaim political influence. They returned with a new vision of power, power that reached beyond Florence's walls. Giovanni de' Medici, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, had spent his youth in Rome studying church politics while his family was exiled. He learned how the Vatican operated. Alliances made in whispers, wealth moved unseen, favors traded behind altars. So when he became Pope Leo X in 1513, it wasn't fate, it was strategy maturing. Florence was no longer just a banking city. It was now tied to the heart of Christianity. As Pope, Leo X ruled with the confidence of someone raised in a palace full of poets, scholars, and political thinkers. He believed glory and faith could coexist, that beauty honored God. So he reshaped Rome into a theater of magnificence. Artists like Raphael filled halls with frescoes. Musicians performed at lavish feasts. Diplomats from across Europe witnessed the Medici aesthetic. Elegance as power, culture as authority. But everything beautiful required money, and Leo X ensured that church finances supported Medici ambitions at home. Florence received protection, funding, and political legitimacy simply because one of its sons sat on the papal throne. However, this luxury had a shadow. To sustain the Vatican's spending, the church increased fees and expanded the sale of indulgences. And in a quiet German town, a monk named Martin Luther wrote objections that soon shook all of Europe. Leo X dismissed him at first. Florence had seen critics come and go. But this time, protests spread like wildfire. The Reformation had begun, and the Medici Pope's decisions helped ignite it. What the Medici saw as patronage and beauty, others saw as corruption and excess. The Medici did not fully grasp how deeply Europe was changing. The world was shifting away from the unquestionable dominance of church power. The Reformation challenged the foundation upon which Leo X had built his authority. And yet, even as criticism spread, Leo X continued to believe that culture would outlast conflict. To him, art and power were eternal, while protest was temporary. History would later prove him only half right. Leo X's papacy extended the Medici name across Europe, but it also placed the family in the center of a conflict that would transform Christianity. Florence now held power that could shape nations, but the cost of that power was growing, and the seeds of future instability had already been planted. Catherine de' Medici was born into this world of shifting alliances and political uncertainty. She was the daughter of Lorenzo II de' Medici, a descendant of Lorenzo the Magnificent, but she lost both parents when she was still a child. Orphaned yet valuable, she became a political bargaining piece in Europe's great dynastic game. Her marriage to Henry, the future King of France, was arranged not for love, but for power. Catherine carried the Medici name into one of the most influential courts in Europe. At first, Catherine was overlooked. The French nobility saw her as foreign, plain, and politically unimportant. But Catherine inherited something her ancestors valued more than beauty or status: the ability to observe, calculate, and wait. She studied rivalries, alliances, and personal weaknesses. And when Henry died unexpectedly, catapulting her young sons to the throne, Catherine stepped forward, not as queen consort, but as regent, the one who ruled in their place. Suddenly, the girl they dismissed was the woman holding the keys to France. The country she inherited was fractured. Religious war between Catholics and Protestants threatened to tear France apart. Catherine, deeply shaped by the Medici tradition of balancing art, diplomacy, and power, tried to stabilize the kingdom with marriages, negotiations, and symbolic pageantry, the political tools her family had refined for generations. She did not seek affection. She sought control. Stability was her currency. But history would mark her by one event: the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Protestants were killed. Whether Catherine ordered it or whether she lost control of events remains debated centuries later. But the massacre left a scar on her legacy. Like her ancestors, she learned that power always demands a price, and the price is often reputation. Catherine's story is not just about a queen. It is about the Medici mind, shaped by Florence's politics, sharpened by exile, strengthened by survival. She was the living proof that the Medici legacy had left Florence and entered the bloodstream of Europe. Back in Florence, the Medici used their restored influence to reshape the city into a hereditary state. Alessandro de' Medici, believed to be a grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, became the first official Duke of Florence. This was no longer about soft influence. It was open rule, authority backed by military force, papal approval, and Medici legacy. Florence was no longer a republic pretending to preserve tradition. It was a dynastic state. But Alessandro's position was unstable. Florence was a city that prided itself on memory, and many remembered a time before Medici rule. Nobles resented his authority. Families who once sat in councils now sat in shadows. Alessandro attempted to govern with confidence, but his rule was surrounded by suspicion, whispers, jealousy, and silent resistance. He believed family loyalty would protect him. And this was his greatest miscalculation. His cousin, Lorenzino de' Medici, appeared loyal, charming, supportive, just close enough to be trusted. But Lorenzino hungered for political relevance. He believed Alessandro had abandoned Florence's republican identity. And in 1537, he betrayed Alessandro, murdering him in a private room. It was not simply assassination. It was a statement that power taken by force could be removed by blood. The news shook Florence. People woke to realize the Medici could be killed from within. The dynasty seemed vulnerable again, like during the exile. For a moment, Florence stood at a crossroads: return to the Republic or cling to stability under another Medici. But Florence, weary of instability, chose the familiar. The Medici would continue, but with someone far stronger than Alessandro. Cosimo I de' Medici was only 17 when he was chosen to replace Alessandro. The ruling elites believed they could control him, a young man, inexperienced, grateful for their support. But Cosimo was not naive. He had grown up hearing stories of Lorenzo the Magnificent, of exile, of survival, of the Medici belief that power must be earned and defended. Cosimo immediately reorganized the military, bringing soldiers under direct ducal control, not noble influence. He removed political opponents quietly through legal pressure, strategic marriages, financial leverage, and selective forgiveness. He strengthened Florence's role in Italy and aligned with the Holy Roman Emperor for international legitimacy. This was no longer a family securing influence. This was a ruler building a state. Cosimo I transformed Florence into the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, expanding its territory and centralizing authority. He commissioned grand buildings, the Uffizi, the Fortezza di Basso, and the reimagining of Palazzo Vecchio. He controlled imagery, commissioning portraits, coins, and ceremonies to show him not as a banker's descendant, but as a sovereign prince. Culture remained a tool, but now culture served authority, not the other way around. Unlike Lorenzo the Magnificent, who ruled through affection and cultural prestige, Cosimo ruled through structure, discipline, and permanence. He believed love was temporary, but order could last. And Florence obeyed because Cosimo made chaos feel like a distant nightmare. By the time Cosimo died, the identity of Florence had changed. It was no longer the city of proud republican rivalries. It was a ducal court with hierarchy, ceremony, and controlled stability. The Medici had not just regained power, they had institutionalized it. By the 1600s, the Medici were no longer just Florence's rulers. They were European royalty. Their daughters married into dynasties. Their sons became cardinals and diplomats. Their palaces overflowed with silk, gemstones, and art. Their court hosted scientists like Galileo, composers, architects, and philosophers. The Medici were no longer symbols of Florence. They were symbols of dynastic prestige. But power that must be displayed is power that is questioned. The festivals grew grander, the portraits became grander, costumes glittered, ceremonies dazzled. Yet beneath the gold was something new: distance. By the mid-1600s, Florence did not look like the city it once was. Cosimo III de' Medici, who inherited the throne in 1670, carried himself as though he were the guardian of a legacy too heavy to touch. He admired piety and discipline, not luxury or learning. Where his ancestors believed beauty was a form of worship, Cosimo believed beauty was a temptation. And in trying to protect Florence from moral decay, he unintentionally stripped away the joy that once defined it. Under Cosimo III, laws increased and freedoms narrowed. Taverns faced restrictions, music festivals became rare, public celebrations grew modest, theatrical performances were scrutinized. Artists found themselves working under watchful eyes. Florence, once alive with conversation, poetry, and color, now spoke in lowered tones. The same city that once inspired Michelangelo to carve David and Brunelleschi to raise the dome now felt subdued, as though its voice had been trained to whisper. Cosimo believed he was saving Florence's soul, but what he saved was its shadow. The economic consequences soon followed. Trade slowed as merchants felt restricted and innovation faded. Foreign visitors still admired Florence's buildings and paintings, but they described the city as silent and sleeping. The Medici had once shaped the course of European politics. Now, diplomats stopped in Florence only on their way to more powerful capitals. Cosimo III saw Florence's shrinking influence, but interpreted it as a necessary sacrifice. He believed restraint was faith, but to the city, restraint felt like loss. Inside the Medici palace, the atmosphere reflected the city outside. Rooms once filled with laughter and discussion, now echoed with footsteps and whispered prayers. The grand dinners of Lorenzo the Magnificent, where ideas shaped history, were replaced with modest gatherings guided by religious discipline. The palace still shone in marble and fresco, but the air itself felt tired. Officials served out of habit, not hope. Servants moved carefully, as if sound itself might break something fragile. Cosimo III was not a villain. He was a man afraid of failing a dynasty that had once ruled through brilliance, afraid of being remembered as the ruler who lost everything. So he clung to caution, not understanding that sometimes holding too tightly is the very act that breaks what remains. Florence did not fall under him. It faded. The Medici Bank had disappeared generations earlier, but now the consequences fully surfaced. The bank had not simply been a source of wealth. It had been the engine that allowed the family to build alliances, support armies, influence elections, and sponsor the creation of culture. Without it, the Medici still owned art, titles, and reputation, but not power. Florence became a palace without a voice, a city full of memory, but lacking momentum. Wealth remained in physical form: paintings, sculptures, palaces, libraries. But this wealth was locked, not fluid. It could not build armies, repair trade routes, or support exploration. Other European courts, Versailles in France, Vienna in Austria, Madrid in Spain, grew more sophisticated, more politically connected, more wealthy. Florence, once the heart of new ideas and commerce, became a city admired for its past instead of its present. The Renaissance had moved on, and Florence stayed where it had been. Diplomats visiting Florence described it as a beautiful echo. Its streets were clean, its buildings grand, but its people walked with a kind of resignation. The workshops where young artists once argued about perspective and anatomy now stood half-used or silent. The guilds that once shaped commerce had fewer members. The Medici court, once the center of learning, became a place where officials repeated routines instead of creating them. Influence had not been taken, it had evaporated. The family still held ceremonial respect. Foreign rulers treated the Medici as nobility, but not equals in power. When Florence spoke, others listened politely but did not change course. The Medici name, once a force that shaped Europe, now served as a reminder of what Europe had already moved past. It was a dynasty living in the house of its own achievements, surrounded by walls that had once sheltered dreams, now preserving only their memory. This stage of decline was not tragic in the way war is tragic. It was tragic in the way silence is tragic: slow, unnoticed by days, unmistakable in years. Power did not collapse. It simply ran out of movement. The final generations of the Medici suffered from something no strategy, wealth, or art could prevent: the weakening of the bloodline. Cosimo III had 3 children, but none were able to restore what was fading. His eldest son, Ferdinando, showed early promise. He was cultured, thoughtful, educated. But illness took his strength and eventually his life. The hope of revival fell with him. The second son, Gian Gaston, inherited the throne reluctantly. He did not possess the political sharpness of Lorenzo, the philosophical curiosity of Cosimo the Elder, or the state-building determination of Cosimo I. Instead, Gian Gastone carried something heavier: the awareness that the story was ending. He withdrew from public life, spending much of his rule isolated in the palace, surrounded by a shrinking circle of attendants. Florence did not resent him, it pitied him. During his reign, alliances weakened further. When Gian Gastone died in 1737, there were no heirs, no sons, no nephews, no brothers. A 300-year dynasty ended not with a battle, but with silence. With Gian Gastone's death, the European powers immediately moved to decide Tuscany's next ruler. The throne passed to the House of Lorraine: foreign, strategic, distant. The Medici name would no longer appear in the records of state, but one Medici still lived: Anna Maria Luisa, Gian Gastone's sister, the last of her line. She understood something the new rulers did not. The Medici may have lost power, but they still held Florence's soul. The art, the manuscripts, the scientific instruments, the libraries, the chapels, the archives. the proof of the Renaissance. All of it still belonged to her. Foreign rulers expected it to be shipped to Vienna or Paris, scattered across distant palaces. Florence, they assumed, would become just another city under another crown. But Anna Maria Luisa refused. She signed the family pact, a legal decree stating that every Medici artwork, manuscript, and cultural treasure must remain in Florence forever, for the public, for the city, for history. Not to be sold, not to be moved, not to be claimed by any ruler. She could not save the dynasty, but she saved the meaning of the dynasty. Florence became a place where the past spoke louder than the present. The Medici did not build empires of territory. They built empires of the mind. They did not conquer nations. They conquered centuries. The Renaissance sparked reshaped art, politics, literature, architecture, science, and the way humanity understands intelligence and beauty. The world today, museums, universities, banking systems, secular diplomacy, artistic expression, all carry the imprint of Florence and therefore of the Medici. Their dynasty ended, but their influence did not. Their palaces quieted, but their creations still speak. Their power died, but their world became ours. The Medici did not survive history, they became history.